Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. My name's Anne Morgan. I'm an author and literary explorer, and I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by someone who really doesn't need much introduction, internationally best-selling novelist, award-winning novelist, Victoria Hislop. Most recently, I think, winner of an Author Platinum Award at the Nielsen Book Data Bestseller Awards, which means that you've sold more than 5 million copies across your oeuvre, which is incredible. And you've just returned from Greece, where you were launching the Figurine in Greece.
That's right.
Fantastic. The Figurine is an amazing book, and it's going to be the focus of our session today, as well as Greece in general. But how was that trip? How was the most recent visit, and what did you get up to there?
Well, when I go on my Greek book tours, it's always with a bit of trepidation, because as a English born and bred, although now with a Greek passport, but I still always feel that I might have got something wrong about Greece that they might not like in Greece, because I'm obviously, when a British reader reads my novels, they're usually learning something about Greece from the research that I've done. But in Greece, generally, they go, well, we know about the dictatorship, we know about the theft of archaeological treasures. And so that's when I feel I'm going to face my critics, maybe more than in the UK. But fortunately, this time it went very well. We had an amazing launch actually at the Acropolis Museum, where there is this big gap waiting for the Parthenon sculptures. So it was all very live and very current, because although the book isn't specifically about what we sometimes call here the Elgin marbles, but the Greeks call them the Parthenon sculptures, it's very much behind the words.
Well, you mentioned it a huge number of times.
I do. I mean, maybe I mention it more than I realise I have done.
I think, well, Byron, you even quote Byron's poem. I mean, it's a huge, and it's very timely because it's so much in the news at the moment.
So the Greeks are always happy to know that there is this support coming from Britain. And the fact that I wrote a novel where the Elgin name does appear from time to time is slightly coincidental with the timing that we've now sort of found.
Yes, because we should say the Figurine, it's about a young woman, Helena, who inherits her grandparents' apartment in Athens, and as part of that, she uncovers some uncomfortable truths about her family history, and also becomes embroiled in a story about archaeological artifacts and what happens to them, and the somewhat shady, or less shady as perhaps a euphemism, market for artifacts and trade in ancient goods, ancient works of art and
treasures.
Exactly.
And it is slightly ironic that although I do, and I have played quite an official role in promoting Greek tourism, at the same time, I'm not afraid to write about the less attractive side of Greece, so the reality of it. And that's the thing that always makes me a bit nervous, especially now they've given me a Greek passport, which was a wonderful gift 3.5 years ago. And I often think they're going to say, oh, you've betrayed me because you're mentioning, some Greeks that aren't saintly. You're mentioning, very dark political periods. But they seem to trust that I'm writing about them in some ways with love and with respect. But I think love and respect involve telling the truth.
Absolutely. And also I think presenting a rounded picture, because it would be very easy, I think, to exoticize and romanticize and present this picture-perfect postcard image of what the Greek islands might be like, what Greece might be like. But you don't do that. I mean, you present some very beautiful parts of Greece, but you, as you say, also do present some of the really tough and darker periods in quite recent history. I wondered about your research into that, because there's some really magical bits where you, for example, describe watching the moon landing in Athens. Helena, as a child, goes and sees the moon landing and watching it in the cafes, sneaking out actually because she's not allowed to watch it by her grandparents. How did you get into under the skin of that experience, of what it was like there then?
Well, it's generally reading. You know, that's for me always the starting point with writing a book, is reading maybe 80, 100 other books that have come before. And that's always the joy for me, is the research period. So in a situation like that, where I would want to feel the atmosphere of that day when there was a landing on the moon, and then magically I come across details such as it was the first live sort of broadcast ever on Greek television, which made it even more exciting there. And knowing that at that time, many, many people didn't have televisions, so they all went out and watched it in the cafe. So you kind of begin to build a sort of picture of what you're trying to convey. And then you look up the weather, obviously. You know, was it a freakishly hot or cold day? And you can always find weather reports, quite accurate weather reports, way back, you know, not in books, but on the internet. And you can find out, obviously, what time of day it was in Greece then, because it wasn't the same as when I was a child watching those events down in Kent, where I was at the time. So all these details are always available somewhere. And having watched other international events on television in cafes in Greece myself, I know that it's always much more of a group activity. It would have been very unlike the Greek sort of psyche to say, oh, we're going, even if they'd had television, to stay at home and watch it. You'd want to be with everyone. The cafe owner probably would have given free drinks, and it would have become a big party, which included the presence of children, for example. So all that in that particular moment that I describe is, you know, it's a blend of actual fact and things I know about Greek society that allow me to conjure up the scene.
Which you do beautifully. I wonder, what is it about Greece? I mean, you haven't written exclusively about Greece. Some of your other novels are set in other places. Your first novel, The Island, was set around Spinalonga, which I happen to know because I went on honeymoon and stayed just opposite it and went to visit it. Yeah. But I wondered, what was it about Greece that captured your imagination? Why has it been such a theme for you, and why are you now so deeply enmeshed with that country?
Gosh, that's lots of questions in one.
Yes.
I now regard myself as being lucky that until the age of about 16, I had only ever left the UK once. So I didn't really have any idea about what Southern Europe looked like. I think we went to France on a day trip, which everybody did in the early 70s. And then, in fact, the second trip was to a cousin's wedding. And both of those experiences were Brittany, Normandy, so not that far distant from the UK. But when my mother and father got divorced, and my mother then made decisions for the first time really in her own life, she decided that a priority would be to take us, me and my sister, to somewhere a little bit more exciting. And that for me was a life-changing moment, because as a 16, I think I was 16 and a half, you know, landing in Athens, rather as Helena does at the beginning of the story. She lands at the time the airport was in Glyfada, by the sea, and it's totally transformative. I didn't just get off the plane and go, oh yeah, blue sky, blue sea, that's pretty. I went, this is incredible. I mean, the blues are very like, in fact, I think that's Africa in the destinations poster, but that translucence of blue.
And on the cover of the book
Yeah.
as well.
You very rarely see that under a British sky. And for me, it was just an explosion of joy and excitement and the feeling of being warm. I mean, very, very simple things, actually. And I fell in love with it 100%. And from that year through the rest of my teens into my 20s, started going every year and then several times a year and then many times, you know, just it built and built to the point where I'm now not quite 50% of my time in Greece, but getting on for it.
And you do speak Greek as well?
Yes, and I've learnt the language, which has been a great benefit in so many ways, in my friendships, talking to people for research, being able to read. You know, I dig deeper and deeper all the time. And the 20th century, which I think for a lot of British tourists is, you know, as it is with many countries, we maybe with Greece, it's obvious what has been there for thousands of years because it's still standing. And you land in, you go to Athens, and everywhere, every time you turn a corner, wherever you are, you can see the Parthenon. So we know what's been standing there for thousands of years, but much of that more modern history is clearly, you know, it's not written in the streets. And that was the bit that really caught my imagination when I started to read from about the early 1920s up to now, the present day. There are just so many, I think, dramatic events that have happened in Greece. And things that have, in a way, I'm not saying they are remotely passive as a people, but many things have sort of happened to them. And that's really what I explore in my fiction.
And painful divisions that have set communities against one another, or histories that are half hidden, with wrongs that were done in the previous generations still being felt, echoing down the generations.
I mean, similarly, that was a discovery in The Return, which was set in Spain, which is a civil war that the British are much more familiar with, because a lot of young Brits went to fight for the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, whereas the Greek Civil War is, you know, not something that we would necessarily read about in our school textbooks, but was an equally destructive and ugly period of Greek history.
Do you think that as an outsider in some senses, although now a Greek citizen, you have an advantage in probing these topics, in that you're not someone who has any kind of direct relationship to that history? So you're neutral in a sense, in that people on both sides could perhaps
very
talk to you.
Very much so, because most families have some connection with the Civil War. Obviously, they were either left or right, because Greece was very divided during that period at the end of the 40s. So yes, I mean, I can do my best always to be objective, and I don't have the pressure of family or politicians wanting me to write about it in any particular way. So yeah, objectivity may be, because obviously there's lots of literature in Greece about the same things that I write about, but perhaps there might be a different bias in them.
Yeah, a different agenda of some kind. I wondered, I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about feeling a degree of trepidation around the Greek response to each new novel. I wondered who you are writing for when you write. Are you writing primarily for a British audience? Are you writing with a Greek audience in mind? Are you trying to cater to both? And how do you manage that? Interestingly, you, for example, you make Helena someone with a foot in both camps. She is half Greek. She spends her summers in Greece growing up, so she speaks the language, but she is an outsider, enough of an outsider that she can notice what is strange or what might not strike someone who is immersed in that culture all the time in the same way.
Yeah.
How do you straddle that?
I primarily write, sounds really selfish as an answer, but I write for me, because during the 3 to 4 year process of writing a novel, nearly 3 years of that is research, and the writing is the kind of the final third of my time. So at the beginning, the whole finding out about whichever subject I'm exploring, all of that I'm doing because I know nothing at the beginning. You know, I knew probably less than nothing about archaeology, to the point where I was embarrassed by how little I knew. And I felt, there I am, a citizen now of this country, which has some of the richest, you know, ancient monuments and treasures in the whole world. And I don't really know the difference between the Paleolithic and the Minoan periods, you know, which is pretty ignorant for somebody who goes to Greece as much as me. So I thought I need to do some reading for myself. And in the course of that was invited on an excavation, one of the probably most significant going on in Greece at the moment in the Cycladic Islands. And, you know, I was learning all the time. And I didn't know at that point that I was going to be translating all of this information into fiction and then it being kind of translated into different countries. So really, I'm the student at the beginning, and I would say with everything I've written, I'm on the learning curve. And then when it begins to flatten out, that's when I think I want to present this in a story form to my readers. And obviously, because I write in English, I know my first audience will be an English-speaking audience. And then usually the second language that comes is the Greek, and then goes into French and Norwegian and on from there. But yeah, I don't compromise for Greek readers. I'm not thinking, oh, they'll already know this, so I'll leave it out, because they'll know, for example, let's say what happens at the feast of a saint. You know, if I kept thinking, oh no, this will bore my Greek readers, so I won't write it, then I would be doing a disservice to my British readers. So I think sharing with my fellow English language speakers, many of whom, like me, go on holiday a lot to Greece, because I was that person for 20 years before I started writing fiction. So I'm, in a way, thinking, I would like to have read this book about this subject before I'd written it, if you see what I mean. You know,
Yes.
The island was a very good example, because I couldn't, for the life of me, think why no one else had written that book.
It is an incredible island, isn't it? I mean, it's very close to the coast. It's a tiny little island, and it's where the lepers were put. At one stage, you'll have to, you know, much more about it than I do, but my memory is a bit. But it's very eerie to visit now, picturesque but eerie, because it's a place where people were.
I wanted everyone to know about that, because I was so surprised by it myself. One thing I must mention about this book, because we're at destinations and everyone's here planning where they're going, maybe this year and next and the one after, is that the richness of the Cycladic Islands is so great for me that I didn't want to pick one island to set a lot of the story on. So I made up 3 islands.
I was going to ask you whether
and
they were...
already
yeah.
people have got in touch with me and said, I've been to my travel agent and I really want to go to Apalos because it just sounds idyllic. And then I have to write back and say, well, it doesn't exist. But if you go to Naxos, Milos, Foligandros, Seriphos, Sifnos, you'll find elements of all of this. So rather than sending people to one place, I send them to the whole of the Cycladic group. And that's true of Apalos, Nissos, and what's the third one? The tiny one. I should remember that. It's my book.
I'm afraid that I have many notes, but I haven't got...
Amos, because I've made up the names so that they slightly reflect the characteristics of these particular fictional places. But in every Cycladic island, you meet some of that beauty.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly... The descriptions are so lush and arresting. But also arresting, I think, and really tantalising are your descriptions of food. We read... At one point, Helena travels with her parents, and they do a tour which turns out to be very poignant for reasons that we won't spoil the plot with. But... they eat some delicious food along the way. It's really mouth-watering. I was wondering if you had to pick one Greek delicacy that a visitor to Greece might try, what would be your absolute favourite? Because you write food so beautifully.
Yes, I'm obsessed with writing about food. And I think because everyone's sitting here looking a bit interested, I think everybody has probably been to Greece. And if not, before you leave today, you'll probably go past a stand that's selling you a lovely Greek trip. The weird thing about this answer is I'm strictly speaking a vegetarian. So particularly in the Greek islands, because a lot of food is the cuisine of, let's say, restricted resources. You know, I don't want to say a diet of poverty because that sounds too extreme, but a lot of food that's made with pulses and vegetables, you know, these are ingredients that are very often the ones that people are growing. And because of, you add olive oil, Greek olive oil, to anything you prepare, and it puts it up to almost a notch of gastronomic delight. But having said that, I think the sweetest and the most delicious food is the lamb that they cook, for example, particularly on Easter Sunday, which is the end of a sort of long leading up of different delicacies on the previous few days, and before that, not eating meat at all for 40, which a lot of particularly older Greeks definitely do. It's not like, oh, I'm giving up chocolate because it's Lent. They actually leave out certain key ingredients in all the weeks leading up to Easter. And then on Easter Day, in the villages, you see a whole lamb going around on a spit. And it's not just because of the way it's cooked, which is very slowly and constantly basted and being quite often turned around by hand by whoever's around to do the job. It's because it's this shared ritual, if you like. So food moves from being something more than just, oh, what am I going to fill my plate with and eat? It's something that everybody gets a taste of. And it's just the most delicious lamb you ever eat. And it's partly because of the fact that you're in this group of people who are all celebrating a religious moment, apart from anything. But really it's because it's, you know, there would be nobody in a village who would be going hungry on that day, either now in 2024 or for many decades before. So weirdly, as a vegetarian, I can say it's the Easter lamb.
Easter lamb.
For all those kind of more poetic reasons than just sort of filling your stomach with food.
Yes, the symbolism of it, what it means to the community, that's really, really powerful. The language is interesting because obviously you speak Greek, and in the novel there are Greek words, Greek phrases, some of which are translated and some of which aren't. I wondered what your thinking was with that. I find that very interesting because a lot of my reading and thinking about translation and international literature looks at how much we explain, how much we leave for readers to deal with themselves. And I was interested by your decision not to translate all the Greek or not to have it all in English. How did you arrive at that balance?
Yeah, well, I think little by little, subliminally, my desire is to just write it in Greek.
Really? Wow.
That's exaggerating, but there are certain words which are not translatable exactly from one, like the word pareia, which is means your immediate group of people that you're hanging out with, i.e. your friends for that evening, maybe a little bit deeper than that, but it would take a paragraph really to translate that word. Usually the first time I use a Greek word, I will put comma and then into English and then comma, and then I think it'd be nice for readers to have that satisfaction by the end of the book to know what agape means, or kalimera, all those basic things. And to date, I've never had a letter or an email from a reader who's annoyed that they don't understand, because I think in the context, if a word is kind of sitting comfortably, then readers will either guess it or they'll remember it from the previous time.
Yeah.
And it kind of enriches.
I think readers generally can deal with a lot more difference than publishers often think. So
if I'm describing food, and I write the word pasticcio, I suppose you could say it's a bit like spaghetti bolognese, very loosely, but it isn't. So I love to leave that kind of word in there, and they look quite pretty on the page as well.
Absolutely. Now, as we mentioned, the book centres around this question of cultural appropriation, of how treasures are dealt with or stolen or otherwise misused. You say at one point, or a character says, stealing something from beneath the ground is a theft from the people whose country you take it from, a theft of their culture and their story. Obviously, when you were writing this, the Elgin marbles weren't such a big news story. What was it about this question that really grabbed you, and what do you think British readers need to understand about this issue that we may be missing or may not perhaps have grasped so much?
Well, there's obviously a big difference between the theft of objects, treasures on an archaeological dig, which is a huge worldwide issue, and thousands of items sort of disappear every year, and they go into a sort of initially a place of darkness where they're sort of traded and exchanged and smuggled, because there's now very set laws about what you can take out of a country that's older than a certain number of years. So it's very clear what the law is. So if you are removing an ancient object from, let's say, Greece or Italy, then it's got to be smuggled to get it out. And then after a while, things do appear in sales rooms, and then they often disappear into private collections, maybe in America, perhaps in, I don't know now, maybe in Arab countries, because there's a sort of China. So there's an appetite, and there's a lot of money involved. So the law surrounding those things is very, very clear, but the profit from doing it is also potentially enormous. And then you have the items that were taken from other countries, quite often during periods of colonial rule, when we had a different emotional sort of sense of what we were doing. You know, we didn't regard that as a as theft necessarily.
Our entitlement.
Yeah, there wasn't. That's exactly the word, and we use that word a lot now. And I think much young people now are being taught about empire in a very different way from how certainly I was taught when I was at school. So we're now really coming, and for example, these treasures that have been loaned back to Ghana by the British Museum, well, rightfully, they are a really important part of Ghana's cultural heritage, and it's obviously a matter of opinion, but giving them on loan and expecting them back is controversial, certainly for me. And the Parthenon sculptures, again, a third category, really, because they were taken by Elgin not for us and to educate the poor, ignorant Brits. They were taken by Elgin to decorate his own mansion in Scotland.
Yes, he wanted to put them in his garden.
That was their destination. Yeah. And they only ended up in the British Museum because the 2-year project to prize them with hacksaws and hammers and all sorts of sort of violent means to get them off up right on the top there from the frieze bankrupted him. He spent a lot of money doing that and then having to transport them to Britain, and by the time he got there he was really short of money. And his wife had left him, so he was going through a very expensive... His life was in ruins, a simple way of putting it. And he was given £35,000 by the government to... Basically, that covered his costs for that 2-year, paying the workers and putting these beautiful things on ships. And I've missed out maybe the most important fact that he didn't have permission. He had a letter which was different from the formal document, which people always refer to this firman, which would have been from the Ottoman Sultan, authorising him, saying, yes, take them. That doesn't exist. There's a letter that gave him permission to take copies, take moulds, so that he could reproduce them wherever he wanted. And if he found any smallish pieces, because there was rubble on the ground surrounding the Parthenon, he had permission to take small pieces that were already broken off. So, I mean, for me, extremely black and white with Elgin is that, yes, the British Museum purchased them, but they were buying stolen goods, because Elgin did not officially own them in the way, if I took your necklace and then I sold it to the lady in the front row, she might say, but I've paid for Anne's necklace. It's mine now. And then you have 200 years of debate about it.
Absolutely, ongoing debate.
So I feel quite strongly about it. I think passionately, actually, is how I feel about it, because the Parthenon sculptures they have an international importance. They're a symbol, apart from their beauty and their antiquity and the fineness of their, the artistry. They are part of a jigsaw, and the people who have the jigsaw, most of it, they would like to unite this thing into one whole, which doesn't seem to me unreasonable. So it's a small subject, but it's also a very big one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, the British Museum, it would be nice if they really accepted what I think are the facts, which is that he didn't have permission. They haven't curated them that brilliantly. You know, when they were brought into the Duveen Gallery, which is where they live now, called Room 18, at one point they were scrubbed with wire wool to remove any residual colour, because as we've probably got used to seeing most sculptures as being kind of gleaming white marble, but actually they were painted originally.
Yeah, highly coloured. Yeah.
And although, you know, aesthetically, you know, we all quite like. It's the same with the Cycladic figurines. They were painted, many of them. So we scrub them. We keep them in a very dark gallery, oriented in a very different way from how they were on the original building. And sometimes the gallery is closed because the roof leaks. So there we are.
Yeah.
And I'm not just saying that because I have a Greek passport.
No.
I really do feel that in the eyes of UNESCO, you know, pretty high authority, but we don't, apparently in Britain, we don't accept UNESCO's pressure for us to give them back. You know, we're becoming a bit, let's say I'm becoming a bit political here, but I think we're not caring enough about the eyes of the world and a wave of acceptance and recognition by other countries of where things really belong.
Yeah.
So
we're going to go to audience questions now. If anyone has a question for Victoria, there's a hand straight up there. Fantastic.
It's basically about what you just said. I agree with you. There is no doubt whatsoever that they were stolen by Elgin, and they should be returned to Greece, because that's where they should be. So I agree with you. But the issue is probably with the British Museum, who I would suspect that they would think that would set a precedent, and that if that happened, then they wouldn't have any items at all, because there's Egyptian things there as well. So,
yeah, I'm thrilled that you agree with the basic desire to return them to Greece. But if you take that view, you can add other things, if you're talking to other people about it, that Greece actually doesn't want everything back from the world or even the British Museum, because Greece itself has such a wealth of archaeological treasures that if we all return what we have, they wouldn't have anywhere to put it. So that will never ever happen. Greece will never ask for everything back. It is specifically these sculptures that are part of a bigger whole.
Oh, sorry.
Also, I was going to say, I think from last summer it became much more public knowledge when they had the thefts, these mysterious 2,000 objects that suddenly weren't in the archive, in the warehouses which they have in the basement and off-site. The figure that, you know, it's probably always been on their website, but suddenly we were confronted with it a bit more in our newspapers, that actually they only have on display 1% of what they have in their collection. So 99% of the pieces, objects, sculptures, cups, whatever, in the British Museum's safekeeping are not on view in the galleries. So if they could almost empty the whole place now and then, just fill it with stuff we haven't seen before. So
Knossos, because there was when it was discovered, the guy who discovered it has sort of recreated it, so it's not as it was. Should that have been done, or?
Well, it's very controversial, and I think the majority of people are critical of it now, because it would never happen in 2024. I think we've become a bit more purist. And the extraordinary thing about Knossos is that in those days, back then, the beginning of the 20th century, he bought the whole site. So he owned it, which nowadays that couldn't happen. You know, there are many, many more rules and regulations about excavation and restoration and all the rest of it. So I think Arthur Evans, he probably meant well. He probably thought this will be easier for everyone to imagine what it's like if I put some pillars and repaint some of the frescoes. So I think he probably had a good heart, but I'm quite glad at the same time that that wouldn't be allowed now.
The lady over here.
Hello. Bit of a double-pronged question, but my friend recently went to Crete and she visited Spinalonga, somewhere where I've always wanted to go. But I visited there 18 years ago to Crete, and I was sure at that time you couldn't go to Spinalonga. Has it only recently been accessible, or is that something that I've got in my head? I don't.
It was much more difficult to go then,
Right.
and there weren't nearly as many boats. I'm, to be honest, not sure. I think it probably opened up in maybe the 80s that you could visit.
Right, I would have
But
been able
it
to have gone then,
was-
so I'm gutted, you know. that
Yeah,
I
if it
missed
was that long ago,
Yeah.
it wasn't such a tourist attraction,
No.
and they hadn't restored it, so there was much less of it you could visit.
Right. Okay.
So over the years, it's become, you could say, better looked after. I mean, they've restored a lot of the dangerous and derelict buildings. So
Right.
I think probably for a decade at least after they closed it as a leprosy hospital,
Right.
nobody went there. But now it's, I don't know, 50 boats a day.
Right.
Yes.
The other story, very quickly, like you say about travel in the 80s and how
Can you hold the microphone so the audience can
about
hear?
travel in the 80s and how accessible it was, and I totally agree. I mean, even my daughter now is saying, how come it's so hard and expensive to travel anywhere with a family now, when all the places you took us to, Mum, you know? So what if she wants to go to Greece this year with her family for a first-time family holiday? Both children are under 10. Where would you suggest would be a good starting place to go?
Oh, gosh.
The travel agent hat on now.
Yeah. With smallish children, I would aim either for Halkidiki, which is fly to Thessaloniki and head towards Mount Athos, but you don't go there if you're a woman, which is a shame. I wish that would open up. The beautiful sea, beautiful beaches, and there is some history to explore. There's a lot of places that they could go for the day, because I don't think it's ever too early to, you know, that's how we first went to Spinalonga, was because we were on the beach in the morning, and every day, particularly my husband Ian, who's more interested in history perhaps even than me these days, he always insisted we went to see something, to look at something, because 12 hours a day just beach. But from Halkidiki there are beautiful museums in Thessaloniki. There's Vergina, which is the burial place of Philip, amazing area. Or go to Kefalonia, which I think is an equally lovely, safe island. You can fly direct there. Beautiful sea.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time now. So if you have any questions for Victoria, a shorter trip is to the table just over there where Victoria will be signing copies of the figurine, and you can ask your questions individually there. But for now, I would ask you to join me in thanking Victoria Hislop.
Thank you. Thank you very much.